مساء الخير جميعا، أهلا وسهلا فيكم آه، في هذا اللقاء. بما أنه ضيوفنا اليوم راح يتحدثوا بالإنجليزي، اسمحوا لي أن أقدم اللقاء باللغة الإنجليزية. Good evening everyone and welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. We're very glad to be hosting Way Architecture Think Tank, represented here by Natalie Frankowski and Cruz Garcia, who are joining us from Puerto Rico while preparing for the upcoming Loud Readers Trade School, something they'll tell us more about shortly. This conversation takes place in conjunction with our current exhibition in that same hour, in which Natalie and Cruz are presenting their work, Monuments to the Victims of Capitalism, or Monument to the Victims of Capitalism. For those who haven't yet had the chance to visit the exhibition, in that same hour emerges from and responds to kind of this moment, which is really kind of shaped by the harrowing, reality of these last 3 years of the genocide in Gaza. The exhibition is grounded in the many conversations that have unfolded around us, and particularly within Kanoon in the last 3 years. But fundamentally, it builds on the global solidarities we've witnessed, bringing together artists from the Arab world and beyond to reckon from their own positions and research practices with the urgent questions of the moment, or the urgent questions kind of this moment poses to the world. And so kind of with this in mind, our discussion today will be anchored in the work on display, which we'll return to more directly in the second half of this conversation, but also by the very practice of Way Think Tank, which I think at its core is a really quite a deeply critical project, and one that in its own way is an expression and the reading, I think, of the state of planetary politics, spatial production, and power today. So before Natalie and Cruz introduce themselves with their work and their trajectory, allow me to offer a more formal introduction. Way Architecture Think Tank is a planetary studio committed to critical spatial practice and developing alternative and public design curricula about the built, destroyed, and imagined environments. Founded in Brussels in 2008 by Natalie Frankowski and Cruz Garcia, and now joined by Emma Userix. I hope I said the name correctly. Way oscillates between Puerto Rico, France, and the USA. Their work has been featured in the Chicago Architecture Biennale and the exhibition at the Centre Pompidou, Noise Museum in Nuremberg, Museum of Modern Art in New York, and the Museum of Art, Architecture, and Technology in Lisbon. They are authors of influential publications, including Universal Principles of Architecture, a Manual of Anti-Racist Architecture Education, Narrative Architecture, Pure Hardcore Icons, and more. So Natalie and Cruz, thank you so much for being with us today. For the audience, once again, Natalie and Cruz will start by giving us a brief introduction to their practice and its formation, after which we'll move into a conversation around the work. I'm guessing kind of the conversation is going to take around an hour in total, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. So the floor is all yours, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Khalid, and thank you everybody for joining. We're just gonna go a bit, flip through some images and present a bit of our position related to our context. Why do we make this type of work, and what work, in the exhibition, right? And for the talk, we have chosen these 3 points basically that we're gonna use to divide what we're gonna present to you: narrative architectures, post-colonial imaginaries, and anti-capitalist realism. And then we're gonna start from the end, right? We're gonna start with why anti-capitalist realism, what does it mean for us, and how it informs many of the things that we do, or pretty much everything that we're doing, coming from the world oldest colony, quote unquote, right? Puerto Rico, colonized since 1492. Being able to use that lens to understand, international solidarity, but also international struggles for emancipation, and also the international solidarity of the fascist imperialist states. We use Puerto Rico basically as a lens to understand the world, because it's like colonialism has been tested here already for more than 500 years. And there's many different manifestations of this. A lot of our work is trying to analyze that through the lens of like what activists do, what our artists do, and trying to understand, what other imaginaries are out there, in this realm of necropolitics, understanding I love this t-shirt by the feminist collective in construction in Puerto Rico that reads anti-patriarchal, feminist, lesbian, trans, Caribbean, Latin American, right? So what does it mean to read the world through that lens? And understanding, as you well mentioned, with the ongoing genocide in Palestine, in Puerto Rico, this is such a present thing, right? It is part of all the discourses of our most amazing activists. It doesn't matter how urgent everything is; nothing is as urgent, as the destruction of people, and it's very present, right? Like I think it really allows us to understand the world through what we call this anti-capitalist realism, in the sense that the effects of capitalism are undeniable and must be confronted in such a way, right? Like we cannot continue pretending that the ramifications and the manifestations of the destruction that capitalism is bringing can be dealt in any other way, through our abstraction, through sort of neoliberal ambiguity, austerity, and so on, right? So there's a lot of parallels. Again, what we call this post-colonial imagination, like imagining the world as a colony, not necessarily what happens after the colony, since we haven't seen that yet. And for us, seeing the parallels, genocide, ongoing at home, genocide abroad. Now we're seeing also what's happening in Venezuela, happening in Congo and Sudan, right? Understanding, how we are just numbers in this necropolitical system, and understanding also our relationship in the geopolitical sphere, right? Puerto Rico is a border of empire because it's a colony of the United States in the Atlantic, and that creates also many different forms of violence that allow us to understand many of the things that happen around us. One way for us that we use to understand this, and this is an essay we wrote 2021 or something like that. I don't even remember when was this published. Times this couple of years have been a blur. Is this essay, Cowardice as Architectural Theory, trying to understand how architecture as a discipline has been mostly associated with the cowardice, and a lack of principle, association with the complicit regimes of violence, and how we must take a principled position, even if it's the one that compromises and maybe puts you more at risk, since we're at risk anyways, right, in this colonial regime. So as an introduction, I'm Kروz Garcia.
I'm Natalie Frankanowski.
And here is Imaginaries, right? Which is a really important part of our practice in a way, because it allows us to frame, what we do. This is a letter we wrote to our daughter when she was just born, where we tried to explain the origins of her name, so she can use it as a map, as an ancestral map. And part of this letter that we wrote for her, and we made these collages that are also narratives, about storytelling about her history, is to tell her that the institutions that her parents work for are going to continuously lie to her, including the university, the museum, and so on, right? So we hope that she can use her name as a map, right, to trace the important questions in life. And this is part of how we understand our practice, right? Like the practice of storytelling, of narrative building. These are some of the different facets of our practice, from curatorial to education to all the places we lived in, and how do they inform everything we do, right?
We met in 2008, which was an interesting time because it was the economical crisis, and it was. So when we started, also we were very critical about what we were seeing. That means that how also architecture was not in the world we were in, not responding to what was happening and what the reality of the world we were living in. So we started to try to find different tools to kind of articulate more at that moment the questions we have, and also that goes back to why our practice is called What About It? Why architecture think tank is the idea also of always trying to start a discourse, start a discussion about different topics that for us are really linked to architecture. And you can see, like at the background flipping with a few images of when we started. So we lived in Belgium for a bit, then we moved to France, then we moved to Beijing, to China for 7 years, where we had a practice, but where we also started a small project of a gallery called Intelligentsia Gallery.
An anti-profit gallery, basically, anti-capitalist gallery, right? So it was all about discourse. In these years also we were exploring questions about language, about possibilities of non-colonial language, about possibility of developing ways in which we are questioning the tools we use to represent our ideas, right, our positioning, and this manifested in many different ways, as you can see in these images. It's many years of practice that sometimes manifests in our spaces, or manifest in the street, or in curatorial practice, in education, not only for the university, but for students, for children. One of our earlier projects of this children, an anti-fascist children book, or workshops we will do with children, right? And this has played a very central role, right? From being in Beijing to moving to the U.S. when we live in our first home in the U.S., in the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture, trying to question, the history and the legacy of this idea of the white male architect that is going to save the world through architecture, right? And all the projects that we kind of incurred there with our students, and when we ask them, can you use whatever tools you have to question, the footprint of colonialism, like our students in Columbia did, to the point where they were measuring the colonial footprint of their own institution, right? I think that was a really interesting exercise, as this project of Leon Duval is showing here, where he made a counter-commencement in Columbia University. And we can see by the protests of the students a couple of years later, that was a very accurate project, right? Columbia, here with the logo and the police beating you. I think it's a very accurate depiction of the attitude of the university. Second part, and I'm going to flip through this very quick, narrative architecture. So what is narrative architecture for us? And I think that we're going to maybe talk about this in the discussion, but we believe in continuing this legacy of using media, right, to communicate ideas, and this manifests in many different ways, and it has many different references, from more architectural art, quote-unquote proper, to other practices that are perhaps more into politics or activism. These are some of the books we've been publishing since 2011, and specifically this book that we want to share with you, of Narrative Architecture, a Clinical Manifesto, that frames a form of architecture that is not meant to be built, but is meant to be a critique of ideology. Basically a lifting of the mask of ideology to reveal architecture's true intentions. So we understand that architecture has been used like this somehow in the 20th century, and we wanted somehow to propose that this is something that we must do, and we must do to address many of the important questions we have, like questions of coloniality, questions of empire, questions of asymmetrical forms of power, genocide, ecocide, right? These are some of the images in the appendix of the book, and many of the connects to many of the narrative architectures projects we did early in our career, like Wall Stalker. It says here 15 years ago it was published, so it's quite a while. Or other narrative architecture projects, right, that deal with different questions, at different stages of our practice, including the piece that you have in the exhibition of Monument to the Victims of Capitalism, that was commissioned by a Plaid journal of the students of Rice University, where we proposed this. In the answering the question of the divine, we wanted to think of capitalism as a religion, basically as a fanatical religion, and how we treat it as such, and how it's basically costing us everything, right? It also relates to other books like Universal Principles of Architecture, in the ways that we find ways to bring some of these questions to the fore by the use of images, the use of collaging, the use of storytelling, sometimes more narrative, sometimes more quote-unquote scientific or writing. Sorry, this image got a bit stuck. Questions of post-coloniality, and then the third part of our short presentation is the post-colonial imaginaries. Right, we have a collective called Post Nobis that is post-colonial nobis made with artists, writers. It's an antidisciplinary collective, and we started making anti-colonial propaganda in the 2010s. Part of that propaganda was building on the legacy of the tobacco readers of the tobacco factories. People that will read to other workers who didn't have access to education, and they will read political theory or help organize workers. People like Luisa Capetillo would do this. And we wanted to resurrect this practice in everything we do, right? So there was a lot of developing of anti-colonial propaganda, narrative architecture projects of retaking these landscapes of indigenous genocide that make the narrative of the United States and the Americas, and kind of subvert them by reinserting militarized and monumental architectures in them. Sorry, it's getting a bit stuck. Screen. Hopefully it will pass at some point. Hopefully it doesn't crash. Okay, here. Then it turns into some exhibitions, like a post-colonial room, as you can see here. These are some of the early attempts to make these post-colonial spaces that are working as basically landscape collages in 3 dimensions. This is an exhibition in 2018, 2019. Some of the propaganda posters that were made, right? So it's basically an ongoing narrative architecture project. Sorry, it's getting a bit glitchy. Maybe internet is trying to censor this.
So from take your time, because also there's a lot of details in the image, so it's good.
Yeah, and the GIFs and everything, but usually it should be fine. But these are some of those images of those events, and I'm just gonna flip through this until I get to loud readers, right? Like the early, it became from images to installations to performance, and eventually it became a curriculum, right? And that's where we're gonna end. Right, this is when we transform galleries into these spaces, right, for sharing this emancipatory literature and doing loud reading performances, right? Like, so in many galleries we turn them into these spaces. Narrative architecture is always present, right? Like all these landscapes are always there to storytell and to recruit people for this movement. As you can see, like World Makers Unite, Join Post Novis, there's always these invitations everywhere. And the last project is the construction of this archive online and trade school that we started in 2020, where it's an anti-colonial school, anti-capitalist school, right, where we invite all these people from around the world to offer free workshops. Sometimes, for example, we do a workshop on narrative architecture, or a workshop on reading Kropotkin or Bakunin, or reading Edward Said, or working around Mahmoud Darwish, right, and creating this curriculum based not on the Eurocentric forms of knowledge, but forms of knowledge that are closer to what we're trying to achieve, right? Like we do workshops, like taking all the banned words by the U.S. government and making poetry that can bypass the algorithms, and every now and then commission, like Manual of Anti-Racist Architecture Education, that is trying to rethink architectural education as a form of emancipatory practice. And sometimes we turn in person these schools, right? Like our Loud Readers Trade School that we are hosting our second in-person iteration in 2 days is opening here in Puerto Rico. This is the first one that happened in 2023. That is a school that is fundamentally anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist, where we invite all these people and people fly in. It's a free school and open, right? So people join and participate on all these workshops. There are from everything from land sovereignty to food to science fiction to poetry to film, all the tools that we feel we should be employing in our construction of alternative world making, right? And these are I'm just gonna flip to this, but this is basically the end of the presentation, and also as an invitation for everybody to join us, whether in Puerto Rico or in the many iterations we do online. Thank you. I'm just gonna flip through them as we can start with the.
No, for sure. I mean, thank you very much for that intro. I think it gives actually a really good basis to that discussion. Maybe I think we'll just kind of pause a bit with a bit of slides, and then I'm gonna kind of put up my screen, I think, to start to kind of lead through the work. But it's I mean, I think there's I think a lot that you've mentioned that I'm sure we're going to kind of unfold as we actually go through the work. So I'll maybe just first of all kind of offer a bit of grounding context for our audience who hasn't been to the exhibition, and then we can kind of get straight into it. So can you see my screen? Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, as I said, I think, and just to give some quick context for those who haven't seen the exhibition yet, I mean, this here is the work on display, Monument to the Victims of Capitalism. It's a series of 5 collage images with a really kind of elaborate text written in between them. But kind of just for the broader kind of context, so the exhibition itself is spread across 3 buildings, with each kind of tackling a distinct aspect of what are really, I think, intersectional questions. So in the main building where Way Architecture Think Tank's work is presented, the works are held together by kind of, I would say, kind of a common question, more or less. So this is just an extract from the wall text, and then briefly I'll take you through just some of the images so you get a sense of the broader constellation. There are absences that images cannot contain and the mind and body cannot hold. The works in this space grapple with the realities of ongoing erasure. They trace the histories of loss and the structures that allow them to persist. What lies beneath destruction and what continues to echo after it? They compose an unsettling archaeology of our time, asking how one might speak of or remember a ground stripped of its witnesses. So this here is a work by J. Saloom and Salama Yunus in one room. This is Salama's work, a drone footage of Gaza. A work by Zara Julius from South Africa, Rashid Qureshi, Hazem Harb. I won't get into the details of this, but I think the images I just want to kind of show. Ilyas Kurdi and Adnan Yahya and Paloma Polo. And so I think, you know, some of these works kind of really foreground the difficulty or even the impossibility of representation in the face of what's being confronted. Others, by situating this moment within kind of longer and wider histories of violence, whether they be capitalist, racial, or tied to the very essence of human nature, return to representation as a critical tool, or kind of to the necessity of moving beyond the visible, but to expose what dominant narratives and ideologies kind of tend to conceal. And this is really where your work, I think, enters a conversation in this context. I think it offers a particularly strong representational and narrative intervention, and one that almost turns to fiction as a way to clarify the violences embedded in reality rather than obscure them. And so maybe before we get into the work, you did mention, I think, a brief intro into narrative architectures. But I think just to kind of give a bit more context to people kind of watching this, I mean, why also call it narrative architectures? I mean, it could be storytelling, it could be speculative fiction, but why would you why opt in to call it narrative architecture, essentially?
So why narrative architecture? I mean, there's different names that can be used. Specifically in this context, it has to do with a couple of conversations we were seeing, in the research done in architecture in the 1960s, and this particular movement in architecture where some architects were deciding to use the tools they have available at their disposal to make basically allegorical stories and stories that were critical of certain facets of architecture. Sometimes they had a clearly Marxist framework. Sometimes they were skeptical of the Marxist framework or the critique of the critique, for example. And as architecture students, trying to frame it in that historical context. First, that started as a desire to storytell, and being confronted basically by the academic setting, where people really didn't understand, why do we want to storytell? Why do you want to make a story instead of making a building? And it became a question of how can we answer that question, not only for us, but for people that are interested in this type of practice, right? And I think in that conversation, the whole theory of narrative architecture as a critique of ideology. I have to say also there's many different people that use narrative architecture differently. There's different books that have used the term narrative architecture sometimes to talk about the poetic experience of going through buildings and so on. That's why we wanted to be very specific by making a manifesto in the book, the Cynical Manifesto, right? And the cynic in this case, like Diogenes, that the Greek philosopher that will search the streets of Greece, with a lantern during the day, looking for an honest man. And we were like, this is funny, we could do this for architecture. We could be looking around with a lantern, looking for an honest architecture, right? And that's like where basically these two things come together and allow us, in a way, to create a framework to have a practice of narrative that is critical. It's not just storytelling, right? It's not just saying a beautiful story about architecture, but it's a story that is trying to really engage with ideology and with power and with hegemonic power and so on.
I think there is kind of clearly this this idea of exactly kind of counteracting narrative ideology with, I wouldn't say ideology, but perhaps kind of a wider ground. But also, I think what's quite interesting, and I just realized actually that there are other precedents in the work, is that there is this interest in the monument as a presence and what it can offer. And I think monuments generally, I think, used today within kind of various other systems. So I'd like just to kind of understand actually why you opted into to kind of erect the monument to the victims of capitalism, or at least kind of narrate one, and where that idea came from in specific.
Well, there is in the particular context of the West, and in particular context of the US, there's so many monuments of the victims of communism that they're mostly Nazis, there was a recent scandal where the people were shocked when they started looking for all the people that were listed in these monuments to the victims of communism were basically Nazis and fascists, like openly, right? And there's a continuous propaganda and brainwashing with that. And in a way, we wanted to engage with that. Also, our work in engaging with the post-colonial deals a lot with monuments, right? Because monuments are these manifestations that defy death, as Achille Bembe talks about, like where we try to construct these artifacts to tell a story mostly from a supremacist point of view, right? From a colonial imperialist point of view, of in long-lasting materials like marble, concrete, granite, to defy death. So even after these colonial characters are gone, the images of them are still there. Here we have like Juan Ponce de Leon. We have all these we have the biggest Columbus, in the world maybe, is here. It's like a monster basically. Funny too, because a monument and the Latin origin of a monument and monster is the same. Also, they have the same etymological origin, and it really talks about that monstrosity, right? So we wanted to play with that in a way to subvert that.
And in a way, the idea of monument too is kind of like really pointing out the criticism that we can make to architecture too, like this the idea of the fiction that architecture wants to create, that it lasts forever, right? And it's like something that goes beyond humanity in a way. So the monument too is like, what are you what for whom is a monument when you think about it, right? It's not is again, like the propaganda that it carries is so strong, that that's also for us something that we really want to criticize.
I think just kind of to get everything into I think also some of the imagery as well, and I think just maybe building off of what you said. So obviously kind of these images are images of I think a landscape that is more or less ravaged. There is kind of it's post the action. I think there is also somehow, in perhaps my interpretation of it, that there is still an active violence that is being perpetuated in them. But also, I think the maybe on a wider kind of tone is that you have these images present, these 5 images, and there is a lot of details in them, and also they're accompanied by a text that, while while being very specific about what it is or what it's dealing with, actually leaves also kind of some considerable room for I think movement. And I think maybe kind of to anchor this question a bit, because I did have a conversation with Kروz about this kind of while back, The presence of the cruciform in that first image, I think, is something, for example, that stands out quite well. And I'd like to actually know a bit kind of where that comes from, and actually whether there is a very kind of intended interpretation for how people actually should deal with it or not.
Yeah, this is a type of question that maybe is less direct. I think our politics are very direct. The work itself, I think it leaves room for interpretation, right? I think like maybe that's the difference between maybe an interesting work and fascist propaganda, right? Where fascist propaganda takes you by the hand and slaps you in the face and tells you this is exactly what this means. And creating something that, while being clear in its political stance, is not so clear in the way that you will read it, right? And again, these images can be read in very different contexts. The fact that it's being shown, in Amman is very different if we see this image in the context of Puerto Rico, for example, right? If we think of the cross as a symbol, right? The Americas is basically a project of Christian genocide, basically, right? Like Christians coming from Europe and wiping out, or almost wiping out, entire populations. These crosses appear in many of these landscape paintings, so that could be a reading. But also, on the other hand, it could be a reading about abstraction. All these paintings of Malevich and the non-objectivists that we are always interacting with. Like the black cross, for example, white background. Black square. All these questions too. It also can be looked at as an exercise of abstraction, in the same way that modernism, as a project of abstraction, has been really efficient at basically abstracting the violence that is adhered to it, right? I think like, and this is actually a text we published a couple of years ago about the relationship between postmodernist abstraction and post-colonial resolution, right? How we strive to have a form of resolution that talks about death, that talks about destruction, because modernism was obsessed not only with white walls and pilotis, and some sort of like abstract vocabulary, aesthetic vocabulary. It was really obsessed with the abstraction of all the violences that were connected to it, like from labor standpoint, extraction, colonialism, ecological destruction, right? If we look at the history of modernism through that lens, we can really see how the violence is always out of the frame. And I think like what this project is doing is bringing the project to the frame, but there's still room for abstraction, right? And there's still room to play with symbolism that changes depending on the context in which we are.
That's why we always find it very interesting to also use the different tools of representation for that, right? Because to think it also, as you were commenting on, pairing with the text, right? And understanding also the power that text has in what it communicates versus what the image has. And as Cruz mentioned, is like we like also the possibility for people to interpret it how they want, right? Because that's also the power of the narrative. And in this image is a narrative architecture, as we were saying, is dealing with architecture being the tool of storytelling, right? So how also we can play with that when we imagine all those landscapes and those images.
I mean, actually, kind of because also you've mentioned actually the how it's interpreted. I think across different geographies, and I think one thing just kind of to react to what you're saying was, I mean, with this image in particular, actually I mean, obviously the exhibition poster actually we borrowed from one of the works here, which is the middle work. But actually with this one in particular, this was actually an early articulation of the concept actually that we were kind of looking into within that same hour. I mean, in my view, I think there's something interesting about kind of looking at kind of that quarry and seeing the horizon, and could that smoke in the distance could actually be interpreted, I think, either as extractive economies, but also actually maybe a lot of the bombardment that we've been seeing in Gaza. And I think the perhaps there is something, I think, with that that borrowing of images from different, I think, areas that actually leaves that within the frame of interpretation, as you said, but also kind of allows for a bit of that building up. But I think this is actually a good place just to ask you, I mean, a bit more about kind of the techniques of actually how this comes together. I mean, why opt for collage as a method actually to assemble these images and as opposed to, I think, you know, drawing them out or designing them? Or, I mean, if that's actually something that's, you know, more than just practical in the...
Yeah.
I mean, just also like early on, we always worked with collage in a way because we were always interested in history, and working with collage allows us to work with fragments that already exist. So in a way, everything too has a trace, right? So and maybe this theory is a little less direct, but we also work with the different types of projects where for us it's again, we were speaking about, you know, the mean of storytelling, the mean of offering a critique, and when you collage, it's not just about what the end of the image is, but it's also about mapping, being able to map, working through history and telling another narrative, right, through this practice. And it's also because we're always very interested too in the idea of representation and the politics of representation, and knowing that the politics of representation are never neutral, that they always carry meaning, and how can we be even more intentional in the meaning that it carries because of its source, and how also we can learn through the history of representation, through the history of image making through this exercise too.
And I think, like, to quote one of our friends and collaborators, Liz, he talks about unruliness, that in Spanish maybe it would be like ungovernability. I think like the collage allows us to do that in many different ways. I have to say, these images were done before October 7, 2023, because the project is older, and as we were developing the project, the new iteration of the genocide unfolded. And of course it brought a different weight, but it really shows that it doesn't matter when you do it, because it's an ongoing issue, right? Like, it's an ongoing genocide, it's an ongoing ecocide, and collage is a reminder of that. It's like these images, it doesn't matter where you pick them from, usually they're still prevalent, they're still contemporary. The unruliness also applies to the anti-capitalist nature of the collage too, where you may have property rights over images, and this has happened to us. And you need to use some images, and then like the copyright owner, some weird company that has the right of the image that is not even the author of the image, doesn't allow you to use it, and then you collage it and all of a sudden it's yours. So it's like, what are you going to do about it, right? Because somehow you're protected by artistic laws, you know, that allow you to do that. So it goes against, in a way, the property of the image too, right? You can also work, this is also funny, you know, in the process of sending the images, there was this back and forth between like the resolution of the image and in a way me having difficulty understanding what do you mean by the resolution. It is what it is. This thing can be printed as big or as small because it's not meant to be a high resolution image. It's meant to be a collage of whatever was found, you know, whether on the internet or in a magazine, right? And it kind of challenges, you know, what we think about images, right? In the you know, in an era of like, you know, quality or high resolution and so on. So collage is really interesting, especially also working in digital collage format, right? Because there's also the physical one that I feel, in a kind of perverse way, it may be less punk than it used to be, because sometimes real collages, I think, are done maybe to sell, you know, because they can be more valuable in a market, because they are more original of artwork, while digital collages can be done by everybody, and they kind of have this kind of quick, not precise, not perfect type of aesthetic component to them. I think like that's also really interesting, you know, about the images, and something that we keep thinking. You know, we have tried to conceptualize it too. You know, when we write about you know, what we call the post-colonial method. There's if you go to loudreaders.com, one of the workshops is us explaining how to make a post-colonial image by taking a Manifest Destiny, a settler colonial painting, and finding a statue of Christopher Columbus and decapitating it and throwing it in pieces into the water. So teaching people how to use Photoshop to do a collage while doing a post-colonial thing that you can send to your parents, like here, like happy holidays or happy whatever, here's my post-colonial postcard, right?
So in a way, to go back also to the idea of like history, it's also like, as we say, history is subjective, right? Because the writing of history carries so much ideology. It's like you can reclaim it by collaging, right? You can, as we were saying with the idea too of a falling monument, is like you can reclaim what the main narrative has been, trying to tell you, and like try to like confront it and readjust it.
Which is basically, I would say, similar strategy, different direction as what the AI use for the fascists is right now. Fascists love to use AI. It's almost like heartless art, right? Because they can just write whatever script, like show me like brown immigrants being and a white girl crying, and they make this really disgusting AI slop. It lacks no imagination and it's really shitty, right? So in a way, but it's confusing because it looks really real. So like you have all these old people that have not much computer literacy sharing all this nonsense, AI slop. While on the other hand, these collages are knowingly showing that they are not real, right? That there's something unsettling about them.
They're not real, but somehow they are like more real than AI.
They're more real than AI.
Because
they're both real. None of them are real. Yeah. But there is a recognition that these images are fabricated. They're not trying to fool anybody, really.
I mean, I guess in many ways that kind of maybe goes back, I think, also to what you were earlier saying, kind of on even narrative architectures itself, in the sense that kind of this isn't really, this isn't it's not a removed intervention from reality, but actually one which maybe attempts to become part of that discourse on the real in whatever it offers, and to kind of come into quite material, I think, outcomes or world. So it's not just kind of a theoretical exercise, but actually narrative has a politics, and it is able, I think, to play in one end. But you mentioned quite a few points that actually I'd like to get to if we have time. But actually, just since we've mentioned the point on history and time and kind of being able to assemble, I think, from the collage on different kind of fronts. There is this word, I think, that actually is placed in quite a particular form. So capitalism is death across all calendars, and actually kind of hits you at it's a place, I think, where there is a bit of a pause. And kind of just what are your reflections on that as a term? What's being addressed there, I think.
Time is a colonial construct, right? And capitalism is basically a time measuring device. Right? Our time is measured in relationship to productivity, in relationship of working hours, in relationship of it's really driving everything. And I think, like in this case, we wanted to talk about really the all-encompassing destruction of capitalism, not only being let's say a physical material thing, but also something that really transcends, that it becomes a measuring rubric for everything we do. And it has a play also with what a calendar is. How many calendars have also been wiped out or attempted, how many ways of understand our cosmos have been attempted to be wiped out by capitalism. And by capitalism, embedded colonialism, imperialism, and so on, white supremacy, and white supremacy and so on. So I think like that prose, like the capitalism is death at all calendars, is really trying to talk about the scale. That is not a scale only in size, it's not like just behemoth of destruction and fissuring and fracturing and drilling and spilling, but also in how do we understand our relationship to everything, right? Our relationship to time, right? Our relationship to history. When is history? Like, we are in year 2026 of what? I always wonder these questions, right? When we talk about colonialism, the first image we show, it was November of 1492, right? Puerto Rico being colonized by the Spanish, and how time basically has warped and been destroyed, right? If we can understand the colonial continuum as a continuum, right? It's 500 years of ongoing genocide, right? If we understand, Gaza and Palestine in that context, right? It's not 78 years, 76 years. It is 500 years of ongoing plunder, of ongoing destruction. And it's, in a way, attempting that we start to look in that direction, right? So we start to find the commonalities, solidarities. That's also what the project is calling for, right? It's the victims of capitalism. It's 7 billion at some point, right? So how do we understand ourselves in that relationship, right? Not necessarily about the specificity, but about the collective experience.
Yeah, the project of colonialism is a project of necropolitics, right? It's a project of death in itself, because the only means is a mean that will never get fulfilled, right? With this, like this, it's delirious, I think, also to kind of quote also Achille Mbembe. And so
this one has no sugar.
Sorry, we have a little person who's hungry, providing also some breakfast. Sorry. So I lost my thought. So again, it's like so it's this delirious machine that is in place.
And then if you think about necropolitics, right, like the politics of deciding who gets to live and die, especially who gets to die, one factor about necropolitics is that it measures, you stop being you and you become a number, right? And we've seen this in the Palestinian genocide, right? When people say like, they report that 4,000 died, then it's like, 30,000, then it's like actually 500,000 people, right? What does that mean? 500,000 people died. Like, that's a civilization. That's like many cosmologies, many livelihoods, destruction of ecology, right? Cartesianism requires numbering everything, right? That's also the logic of the calendar.
I mean, I think that definitely. I mean, you're kind of talking about, I think, this really, homogenizing force on one end, one that kind of makes all similar or tries to apply kind of that similar metric. But actually, now as you're talking, I start to realize, and kind of just because I think I'm riffing off of also the point that you've built on the collage a bit earlier, that with every view of this monument, it also, you start to realize that things are multiple things at once. I mean, all right, you have, as you said, that kind of the cruciform, the quarry over here, the smoke, and which could be an airstrike, and it could be, a factory. But over here, kind of, you start to see almost that cantilever that I think has obsessed modernist architects for very long on one end, and then you have those blocks which are kind of that really abstract modernist kind of, monument you always see, but also then kind of this data center kind of vibe, which actually you mentioned. So inside the black cubes, microchips flow to the rhythm of cryptocurrency, the pumping sound of cold water, and the silence of tanks exemptions for ventures. I mean, in many ways, it's quite, I think, it's interesting actually that there is that kind of multiple plural, I think, moment in it, and before actually just so since we're here, I mean, there's this very essence of actually, I think, creating a monument to the victims of capitalism. So you're talking about kind of post-capitalist, monument. I think for me, in specific, was quite interesting in the sense that you're being very, very specific about what this is. I mean, it's I think it's a very defined, you're talking about GDP here, you're talking about exponential growth, modernity, you're talking about value, you're talking about metrics, measurability. And I think so kind of that containment of what it is that you're talking about, and actually having a vision or views or perspectives of someone looking in a moment post its time. I mean, I'm kind of curious actually, if because you've mentioned, I think, anti-capitalist realism, I think that this is kind of just a good place to kind of maybe, I think, reflect on that a bit. I mean, what were the stakes of trying to imagine a world after capitalism in a collage like this, and what challenges actually came up as you were thinking through it?
Yeah, what type of political scenario is this that you're allowed to build a monument to mourn the victims of capitalism, right? I think like that's a it requires some imagination. That's where we wanted to go. Also, having made some maybe not so optimistic narratives, trying to challenge that in a way. Also out of anger, I truly hate many of the discussions that we have around capitalism, because there's a sense of inevitability to it, where this Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek quote of it's easier to imagine the end of the world to imagine the end of capitalism is such a Western tired way to look at the world, where it's completely not true. That's like, if you cannot imagine the end of capitalism, you're just mentally lazy. Like, you haven't exercised. That's the most amazing exercise of creativity, is to imagine what comes after all this nonsense is gone, right? And in this particular case, there's many different references, from the slave ships, the diagrams of the slave ships with all the bodies, to like data centers and so on. Some of them more direct than others. But it is also to address that when we talk about capitalism, in the same way that when we talk about colonialism, it's not a thing of the past, right? People are like, why do you want to deal with the past? It's a thing of the present, like immediate present, right? And they're connected, right? And I think like that immediacy, that connectivity is really important for us in this project, to be clear that there are monuments there inside the monument that are from the past, but this is the present and the future, right? Like we are all embedded in this. It is about the tech oligarchs. It is about the people working for NVIDIA and from Albeit Systems, or working for Palantir. But it's also about the politicians that are defending the monuments that are standing in the plaza. And for the people that are allowing to use our air, to go and bomb our neighbors, our brothers and sisters, right? Or to manufacture weapons here to be used in Palestine, right? So that connectivity is really important. And to imagine yourself in such a space. It's basically like seeing a cemetery for capitalism, right? By being able to commemorate the victims of it, right? That is basically the whole planet, if you think about it, right? And that's where it's going, with the 7 billion, potential victims of this system, right? Because of the ecological spoliation and all the destruction that is attached to it.
And all that, capitalism, also the ideology around capitalism gives to you is a fiction, right? And also like it's so strong as, the critique that we want to make about history, or about, the idea of narratives and so on, is how there's many other ways to think the world and to be in the world. There's ways that have been also before capitalism, right? And there's many people also living, thinking about all those different ways too. So also like how, because of a force of this, it's not even a dialogue, right? Capitalism is not a dialogue, it would be like a monologue, right? And how we just want to challenge that into thinking also like a narrative that would be, as Kروz mentioned, like more about a dialogue, about possibilities, about what is already there somehow, because it exists.
I mean, I think there are, for me, almost kind of positions in what you're saying. I mean, kind of with every image, you're like, it's not the data center, it's not the icons and the statues, and it's not yeah, I mean, kind of not that, but also, so just kind of with these two images, I think they're quite actually important kind of to look at, but they're also not Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome and the Golden Gate Monument, which Kروz actually pointed out to me yesterday. And actually, I would like to ask you about those two specific references, because I think it's in the end, it's kind of, yeah, I mean, it is it's monuments to the victims of capitalism. I think we brought this up in conversation that for me actually it was brought up in a conversation with someone else that there aren't people in these images in terms of kind of inhabitation, but it's a graveyard of what what is kind of all these other kind of ideas that were there. So I'm before maybe I wrap up with a final question, kind of especially in this composition, I think there's kind of three very kind of specific kind of objects that I'd just like to kind of understand a bit more about where they came from before perhaps I ask you, I think, a bit of a challenging question before we wrap up and open up to the audience.
I mean, of course, there's a lot of multiple readings, but I mean, we can be very specific about why choosing, in this image, and it's a bit small, so I don't know if the people can see it, but it has there it looks bigger. There's a lithium salt, mines, these pools that are created. These are images of, this is how it looks like when you extract lithium. It's quite beautiful, I have to say. Extraction is quite beautiful. Also, it shows you that beauty is not necessarily good. The gate right in St. Louis that is literally called the West, for westward expansion. So it's celebrating indigenous genocide and the expansion for the construction of the United States. The Cartesian dream of Buckminster Fuller, that was a germophobe, like he was afraid of bacteria and germs. And all these architectures are like kind of utopian architectures, very engineering-like. These are marvels of engineering, to drill a hole of a pit mining, salt extraction, oil drilling. Those are marvels of engineering if you want to look at them in one way. On the other hand, there are also monuments to our debris, our hubris, our these ideas of modernity that are attached to capitalism, to colonialism, to the expansion of manifest destiny of the West as this supremacist ideological epistemological system, systems of knowledge, systems of living, or systems of not living. So they're very strategically put in that way, right? Like there's also a cargo ship somewhere there. That plume in the back comes from an actual accident, right, of oil extraction. So the images really, and then the open pits, all these things, they have a reference. But I had to say, there are images in this. There are people in these images. We are looking at them, right? Like and they're made in such a way that you can present yourself to the image, right? Like you can understand that relationship while looking at it. That's also how we saw the project in a way. Like we are looking at this, and we are describing it also. It is not, in this case, it's not a world without humans. Although maybe you can read it like that.
I mean, with each image, I think it's just kind of something worth recalling that I think, I mean, as you say, the references are specific, but you almost start to see kind of almost a formalism in which actually you can kind of re-understand this project. You see, I think the grids on the ground, which I think could be the lithium batteries, but they could also be kind of plots of land divided, I think, on. I mean, there is that kind of multiple layer, which I find quite interesting. Maybe the question that actually I mean, maybe not necessarily challenging, because I think you just mentioned it, but there is something aesthetically, beautiful about some of these images. I mean, we're looking at what is kind of an extremely dark reality, but also I think
extremely white reality.
Extremely white reality. Extremely white reality. Fantastic. Yes. But it's. But there's something. Yeah, I mean, there are landscapes which are composed and attached in an aesthetic that I think is quite carefully considered and enticing. And I mean, did that ever come up in conversation actually as you were, should this be ugly? Should it not? Should it actually represent violence in a way that, is quite, heavy or not? I mean, was this ever a discussion that kind of happened between you guys?
This is a great discussion that is part of our work, and we pass it very quickly. When we are showing the shape poems, the black shapes, the triangles and stuff like that, because we are anti the concept of informality. To be informal basically is the way that we're called by empire to say that we are disorganized and poor and uneducated and uncivilized. Formalism is something that empire does, right? And we completely challenge that. We completely disagree, right? Like we are form makers, and we are very conscious about our aesthetic decisions. Revolution has aesthetics. Subversivionists have aesthetics. So some of the people that we show at the beginning of the presentation, like La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción, for example. It's amazing, their aesthetic project, right? It's an aesthetic project used for liberation. But it's a very clear aesthetic project. We can see the purple colors, we can see the manifestos, we can see the aesthetic, the graphics, and we play with that. We acknowledge that. It's aesthetics consciously appropriated and used for emancipatory discourse, right? Form is for those who take it and make it, right? And I think in that case we are very conscious about everything we do, from the publications to the images to the way we lay out text on the wall or in a paper, right? The fact that this narrative architecture project is slightly different than other ones because it's written in poetry, right? And there was a challenge also even to translate some of the things. What is the role of poetry there? Poetry is structure, right? It's all about form. You can replace words in poetry and use shapes, right? And it still works. And I think that's also part of the power of poetry. Is not only that it's extremely political and it allows language to play and to play around. You can subvert it and bend it, but also the form component. I think poetry may be the most formalist form of writing, if you think about it, right? And that's a very conscious decision we're taking.
I think that's actually a great note to open up, I think, to the audience. Unless, Natalie, if you have anything to add, or I can kind of...
We can open the
Perfect.
discussion. Thank you.
I'm going to stop sharing the screen, but we might bring back some images as the questions come through, just so I can kind of see also what's coming in terms of questions.
There's a question already by Abir.
I think this was asked a while back, so I'm not sure if it still is a relevant question. So she was saying, you took us...
what I'm against in capitalism? Everything, like the racism, the destruction of the earth, the commodification of life, the commodification of people, the exploitation, the extraction, the fishing, the racialization, the accumulation of wealth, the construction of nation states based on extraction, based on slavery. What else? There's nothing I like about capitalism. This is the easiest question for me to answer in general. Right? I despise the system. I despise the defense of the system. I despise what it does to us, what it does to life, human life, non-human life. I despise everything about it. Now, what options are there? Plenty. There's solidarity, mutual aid, indigenous organizations. Basically look at everybody getting bombed. There's an option there, right? So we need to stop bombing people that are proposing questions to capitalism, to the settler colonial state, to the imperialist state. From the Zapatistas to the feminist collectives here, what we're doing our readers here in today's, we're bringing all the people that are working with, land sovereignty, trying to grow their own food, learning agroecology, learning to be able to sustain themselves and to sustain society. There are plenty of projects around the world that are challenging capitalism daily, right? But they're violently being oppressed, right? So I would say that there's many different options. There's as many options as there are groups around there, right? And in every context you're gonna find options that are challenging capitalism, I would say.
I think just if any questions kind of are coming through, you can kind of type them through the chat. Sorry, I didn't clarify. I think that, and if anyone wants to raise their hand, if they would rather speak, we can also kind of facilitate for that to happen. I think you did mention just one place, just because as kind of questions come through, and I did want to get back to this actually when you mentioned it in the first place. It's a bit of a niche point, but somewhere in the text. So actually, I can just come back to this here as people come through. So you mentioned somewhere. Oh, just to make sure that this is. Okay. So you mentioned here, we're talking kind of about material, I think, rights, and then, getting into private property and intellectual rights and theft and ownership. And I think this is kind of, there is something I think interesting here in that response that that impassioned response you just gave on proposition, and I think this is something that actually I see kind of at stake in the collage and in the whole project of narrative architectures and the forms that you're proposing. As architects, as people who are writing, what's the beef with intellectual rights in this case, and why actually mention it within kind of it's obviously kind of something that has been kind of, I think, a topic that came up, I think, here. So I'm just kind of a bit curious to get more off that, because I think actually this does come up quite a lot in general, I think, conversations and discourses on research, and somehow there is a lot of anti-colonial agendas being advanced, I think, mostly within kind of university context, which is like, no, actually intellectual rights is what actually should be kind of even more particular, I think, in relation to these issues. So I'm
yes, I think it's just a colonial. What is an intellectual right? Who has intellectual right over anything, right? Like the fact that just look at the case of AI, right? How they can take any information they want for their commodifying it, right? Without asking for any permission, and that's always been the case. There's a tendency in European context to assume that because all the other forms of knowledge they are continuously devouring and commodifying, they're not valuable or historical. They can be used. They have no authorship, right? While everything that is done in the Western context has some authorship, right? And that's what capitalism does, right? Like basically creates an author and then frames a whole price around, a price that you have to pay for it, right? I don't believe in that. I think that this is a construction, just like time is a construction, and it's a very capitalist, colonialist way to look at ideas and who invents ideas. It is such a weird, for me, it's such a weird. Even as a teacher, it's something that we always telling the students too. Is like, we're not making anything. We're basically reusing things that exist in history continuously, whether we want to credit where they come from or not, right? I have a big issue with this very famous French. He died recently. What's the name? The French Bruno Latour, right? Made a career of ripping off indigenous knowledge, but then he will only quote European thinkers as his references. That's an issue. We have colleagues that have published books on non-referential architecture, because for them, if you're copying something from Africa, it's not really a reference, right? References, if you are, referencing Le Corbusier and Borromini and whatever, right? It becomes this. It's a game, who makes the rules? Who's allowed to break them? What are these rules for? Like, what is this bringing? How is this giving me any liberation? For example, like, am I free? Is intellectual property freeing me? I don't think it is freeing me. I don't think property is freeing me. I'm against property, like a good old anti-capitalist. So to think that ideas are property of somebody is such an insane thing. We can talk about like who are all these things in the context of the U.S. even in the medicine standpoint. You have these companies basically privatizing medicine or privatizing seeds. You know, in Latin America, that's a big issue where they use seeds that don't grow anymore. If the wind blows them in your land, they're the property of the company that has the intellectual rights over that seed. It is insane. Those are capitalist tools, and we can look at it in art too. You know, like, but you know, we can look at art as a big human activity. We can look at it as a market, right? I refuse to look at it as a market, right? So more or less, that's where it's going. That argument against the intellectual property.
And it's tools of, as Cruz mentioned, like of hierarchizations, right? From like hierarchization of knowledge, hierarchization of offers too, and how, you know, this we can see also strongly when we can criticize also academia and the history behind, you know, the knowledge that is being shared in academia, right? Or and where, you know, mainly as Cruz mentioned, like, you know, where does all those sources come from, and who are the voices that are put, you know, up versus the other ones that you don't really see or don't have any platform to be shown. So I feel like also when we question that, is also because it's a unjust system, right? That is all the contrary of being equal. It's just about, you know, creating again like this kind of main narrative, this main body of supposed knowledge that is supposed to be unquestioned and being just offered to you as a truth, right?
There's three questions that we've just gotten. So the first is, how and where do you think it's possible to start changing the status quo, considering that the system is powerful and held by the people in power?
I mean, many different ways. You have to be careful to not get bombs thrown on you. That's the only issue, right? There's many different examples, and there's like from, you know, trying to do art on, but also, you know, there's people that are giving their lives to this. Yeah, I don't know. There's so many different ways to go about it. I mean, I'm talking to you under occupation here. You know, there's like military helicopters flying around because they are like terrorizing Venezuela. So it's difficult to answer in a concrete way. But what we try to do with Loud Readers, for example, is to work with people that we think are trying to address these questions, that are trying to figure out ways, you know, whether, you know, learning to grow your own food or trying to reclaim land, you know, and sharing it with the people. Our friends just founded a cooperative of access to the land, you know, where they're trying to teach agroecology to people, but also, you know, protect all this land from development. The Muskogee people in Alabama, you know, with Egan Felician, trying to like keep their language alive. There's so many different ways, very concrete examples, right? We can look at the Zapatistas again, you know, so many amazing revolutions around the world. Not easy. It's not easy because empire is extremely violent, right? For some of the things that we just mentioned. But it's difficult, you know. It's difficult, but then what other choice do we have?
I mean, I just kind of to bundle some questions, I think, here together, just so, because we've actually just gotten quite a few, so just to be able to get into them. There's a question, I think, which maybe builds on this and asks kind of about this idea of being able to kind of enact change while being within that system, or kind of acting from within it. I mean, first of all, do you accept that notion that we are all within it? And the second is this something actually that you both kind of come across within your practice, as well as, I think, you know, practicing within universities, practicing within, I think, a general kind of academic environments, and beyond that, I mean.
Yeah, I think it's been like a really, I mean, it's something that is really important for us, is, as you mentioned, like being, you know, part, for example, of academia, being you know, part of institution, working a lot with institution, and how we can, you know, still try to be critical, because that's also our practice, and that's what also we, again, as we were saying, like a lot of our practice is a lot about, you know, the importance of starting discussion for us, because we think that, you know, we don't carry the answers, but as a collective, we can, right? And it goes back to what we were just starting to discuss about the possibilities of having, for example, like different alternative or different systems. Like there are so many different ways of practicing, thinking, existing throughout the world, and we now we have been working a lot, and we've been very inspired in working with different collective projects and finding ways to collectively work also within, for example, the framework of institutions and so on, and how can we, bring the voices of the questions that for us are urgent or have to have a place there, right? And how can we find different projects to allow these spaces to be created within those institutions?
There's a question. There's a question there for Natalie. That the questions are not directed towards her. So we apologize. There's a lot happening behind the scenes here because we're a full family. So it's sometimes Natalie cannot talk, and then she's like hitting me on the leg. So please don't judge us too much because it's not. We try to challenge the system by being with the child, but it's not so easy because I think I get a lot of things thrown at me sometimes in other contexts too. Once Natalie was breastfeeding on the floor, and somebody called me patriarchal for sitting on a chair in the same presentation. So I just wanted to put that there. But I think this is a good question.
I mean, the second half of this question is how does how does being a mother and a woman changes? I mean, the whole question is how does gender and sex play into the labor and projects you're already working on? How does this frame the already subversive work you're doing? I wonder about the radical or subversive architectures of being a mother or woman. What does it add to the critique or the conversation?
Thank you so much for the question, for the one who asked, because and of course, like, this is also very important for us. I mean, firstly, I have to say, like, as a woman in the field of architecture, and I also tell that a lot to the students and so on, is like, yeah, of course, it's not speaking of inequalities. It's not a fair field at all, and you have really to be prepared for that. But I think a lot of us are really aware, because that's the reality in where we live, and it goes for one woman, but also it goes through for a lot of different people that don't fit the criteria that is kind of a main. Figures in architecture. So this we know, but also being a mother, being all this is themes that we hope that are also very central in what we do. So that's also why we think that, and we want our practice to be as intersectional as possible, and to include all those questions, right? And again, like, that's also where also working collectively has been also very important for us, because if we cannot be the ones that carry the voices to be critical, we want to allow also other people to join us and to also be part of a critical discourse or critical project. Being a parent really also changed a lot for us. It's, as you can see, Emma is part, right, of our practice. She's part of everything we do, because we live life like this. Like we work in one kind of world, and we have been. I mean, and of course, it's not something new, right? But also thinking of architecture, like, it also kind of puts light on how a lot of spaces around not just architecture discourses, but also architectural spaces too, are not really meant for children, right? And we have been also more critical in how so we practice, or how so we engage with different platforms and different spaces that we create, and how we can try to be as inclusive as we can in that way.
Well, I have to admit, I just found out that Emma was, the third collaborator in the bio was your daughter today. I did not know that. So it was a really pleasant surprise, I think, to see that. Let's take the final three questions, just because we're also already almost running over time, but they're actually all quite interesting. So. Jenan says, thank you for a really interesting conversation. I'd love to know what you think about some of the major architectural projects that are being built or proposed across the Middle East at the moment, such as the line in Saudi Arabia.
This let's say I have my plate full looking at the disaster I have here. So to be honest with you, I don't have much to say because I actually don't know that well. I've never been in the Middle East. I mostly judge countries by the relationship to the US. Usually when they're the friends of the US, I'm very skeptical of them because I know that they don't want the best for their people. And, you know, architectural projects, whenever you have all these star architects involved, that's already suspicious too, right? Because you're not doing really something for the people. That I think like that's more or less where I would leave it, but I don't have very, very specific answers about, not to be like cynical or anything, but I feel like I'm unqualified, not knowledgeable enough to be able to address that. I don't know what are the, other than the line, I actually don't know much either, you know.
The last two questions I think are also kind of interrelated, but let's ask them separately because I think they build on each other. So in monuments, so Shada is asking, in monuments to the victims of capitalism, the works are sort of detached from specific or fixed sites. What does this displacement allow you to do conceptually, and what might be lost when kind of local specificity and situated knowledge are deliberately left open? That's
a great question.
That's a great question. I think it ties a lot to the different points that we were talking about. It's like, in a way, how to navigate between, you know, this idea of being situated, because in a way, as we're saying, by, you know, interpreting it or being able also to kind of read through the different references, there's a level to which you could situate some of the content, but also like as having this kind of, you know, window of interpretation. I think also the, you know, the idea of not in that particular series also not being so situated too allows us to, you know, offer, as we're saying, the critique that, you know, of course history repeats itself, right? And how also this idea that, you know, we cannot really escape a situation means that a situation in itself could be many, right? The idea also of in that way the plural, right, being situation sites. I think that's also where we wanted and how we wanted to build the critique.
Yeah, and there is also something about something. This is also something we talk to our students often. Is about your relationship to a place. I find quite difficult to make projects in general, but specifically narratives about a place. That's why even the question about the Middle East is kind of tricky to me, right? Because I don't know. I am from Latin America. I know parts of Latin America. I'm from Puerto Rico. Natalie is from France, right? We live in China, live in the US. So I think we have a broad view of the world, but maybe for specificities, not necessarily. And sometimes like having these broad concepts are also an invitation for people, like, look, this is possible, and maybe you also could do something similar, maybe with the specificities of the places where you come from, right? So it's almost like many of the things we do sometimes, now that we have slightly more visibility than, let's say, 20 years ago, 16 years ago, is sometimes create something that can be a model for a form of practice that is not ours, right? Always thinking collectively. When we made the manual of anti-racist architecture education, it's not meant for us to say architecture is racist or white supremacist and so on, but look, these are all the issues. Maybe we can justify this, you know, use it as a reference. So when somebody asks you, why are you doing this, you know, like, you know, this is an official architectural theory. Therefore, I can practice in this way, right? I can make my narratives, you know, like, and it has happened, you know, we have students that make very specific narratives about the places where you come from, including, you know, Palestine, or including Libya, or including different parts of Latin America, the Caribbean, the US, right? So I think that that's really, really important, right? Like also to recognize our own limitations when it comes to making these narratives. And sometimes we try to address things in a broader point of view because that's also the life we kind of given, you know, moving around to not sound like the expert of a place. We can talk about systems mostly, right? And I can talk about really specific contextual things in some places, right? Because I think like we have maybe the knowledge, or we work with the people that have the knowledge, but it's not the case everywhere, right? So we had to be careful with that and be modest with that.
And I think it's something also that for us is like we always try also to be self-critical, right, and be critical of our practice and how again we can deal with all those questions without the idea of imposing, right, ourselves, and because also that's for us the critique of colonialism, right? In the writing of colonialism has been a lot about imposing a reading from, in many cases, from afar, right? And how, so also like that's why we also get so inspired by the idea of working collectively, and our practice has been more and more collective in many ways, and it also goes in our own history of moving to different places and meeting people and wanting also to learn or to share an experience together, and that has been also a very formative and important aspect of our practice.
I mean, in a sense, kind of, I mean, with the work that we're speaking about, I mean, there is this kind of this, there is this use of abstraction in order or I'm not sure if abstraction is the right, I mean, displacement actually is a nice term to actually use, I think, in this context, but it is kind of to really try and find similarities, I think, across those systems, but I think part
across
of really
all calendars.
Across all calendars, but I think part of having that really prescriptive definition is also, I think, helps see difference, I think, which I think is often underrated in a context like this. But okay, so I'm going to end with this question, and I'll name the person because clearly they seem to know you. So it's Sari Al-Faytouri. And he says, "Hey, Kروz, good to see you again. I'm wondering, how do you relate to architecture as a design practice? At the beginning of your career, you were invested in architectural competitions and had ambitions of building buildings that spatialize politics critically with inspiration from Russian constructivism, for example, who combine powerfully art, design, collage, pedagogy in their own reinterpretation of modernism. So how do you reflect back on that Western reference that inspired you, particularly its urgency on materializing ideas through buildings, and how do we view that version of modernity?"
I mean, this goes back with, but I have to say, like, we have Western in the practice, right? So, so I think this question is also actually for both too, because it's something that keeps recurring, and we talk about it too, because it's quite interesting to like work with our collaborators here in the context of Puerto Rico, for example, where most of the references of our friends that are writers are from Latin America, right? From Brazil, from Colombia, Argentina, Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, and because we have lived, and we also were formed by Natalie, that is pan-European. There's some references that are also central to our practice. That are not necessarily, they're related, and we see the clear relationship, right? Like especially in those early years of the Bolshevik Revolution, the workers, right? Anarchist groups, communist groups, their understanding of aesthetics, the understanding of internationalism, the understanding of anti-colonialism, also in a way. It informs of many of the things that we're still doing, right? So not only from the aesthetic standpoint, but in the political standpoint. That's why anyways, we were attracted to that research since the beginning, right? Like it was a very specific moment in time where there's a challenge to capitalism as a system, and it has an aesthetic project. And in conversation with that, there was a lot of projects that were developed, early in our career, but they are always present still today. Like even if you look at all those images of the monument to the victims of capitalism, you can see that very specific project in relationship to those studies we were making, right? Like and we talk about it, the cross, the Malevich painting, and I would say it's not so much constructivism but suprematism. Especially the school in Unovis. In the People's Art School in Vitebsk, where children and adults, women and men, were running a program at the same time as the Bauhaus, but much more revolutionary in the way that they were really challenging, hierarchical input like authorship, the gender separation, and so on, to make works that were meant to be in the streets. They were making, the design for the tram, the cars for rations. Unobis. That's why our collective is also called Post-Nobis, the Post-Colonial Unobis, right? Unobis was that school, so it's really present in everything. We do the production of propaganda or counter-propaganda that we are always doing, with a different aesthetic project. But I think in really close conversation. And once we were writing a text, on the theory of the Post-Colonial, one of the texts that we started with, and I remember an editor getting kind of angry at us because they wanted us to focus on Puerto Rico. And I found this is not what it is. It's never been about that. Like, that's not who we are. That's not what makes our practice. I think our practice is much broader. And I don't think we can exist in isolation. We exist in relationships. That's why also collage is so useful for us, right? Because we can put all these things that maybe are dissimilar to some people and make them relate with each other, because they were always related. They were related ideologically, they were related aesthetically, they were referencing each other too, even sometimes, unwillingly or without acknowledging it. And that's, I think, like, it is still very present in a way, but not in the way that the MoMA will show it in New York, right? It is not just it's not the aesthetics. It is not Russian also, right? Like, it was basically against the nation state. It is a project of collectivity, that early project of the Bolsheviks, right? Of the avant-garde, of the Malevich, being an anarchist. I think, like, those things are really important, right? If you look at all this amazing propaganda, anti-colonial propaganda, solidarity with Africa, that still makes it into our exhibitions and to our work today. You wanted to add something?
And I think it was a very interesting question, because it's true that, also our practice I don't think it changed, but it has, I think, like, chapters, and I think that's, also how life is in many ways. And I think, it got informed in also by places we were in at that moment, with also the people we met at that moment, and so on. And I think also our interest towards history and towards history of architecture too. So I think, like, for us, that, as Cruz mentioned, looking, for example, at Vitebsk and everything that was, being produced there, and how people work, and how, at that time, and it goes back also to one of the early questions, a woman was running the school, and that was in the 1920s, right? They were producing collectively without a name, going back to the question of authorship. So there's a lot of theme there that was already linked to our interest, as Cruz mentioned, how to also think of architecture or produce in centered for the people, as much as it could be, how it could be participative, which also I think, like, goes to a link to what become after our interest when we develop also the idea of large readers, right? Working collectively, including many voices, and also including, trying to create spaces where what can be shared there can also be after, brought back or becomes branches to other projects or other platforms and so on.
I think this is kind of a great place to end on, and I think on that link between, I think, just the whole structure of the practice, and I think what manifests through it. First of all, let me just really thank you for your time. I think I understand it's been very busy preparing for Loud Readers, and good luck with that. But I think this was really a very generous conversation, so I really appreciate that. I also, I think definitely it's really, I think animated a lot of details in the work that I think I was really grateful to actually hear more about. Thank you to Emma, who has really been a very unique presence, I think, in this, and I that's it. And hopefully we will see you in Amman soon, and at some point. And thank you to the audience who's stuck here with us. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
See you.